Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the past 10 or so days. I'm just getting over a bit of a cold, so if I sound funny, that is why. So the first book that I picked up during this period was Patient H.M. by Luc Dittrich. As the title implies, part of this is a biography of Henry Molaison, the famous patient H.M., who had brain surgery for a seizure disorder in the early 1950s, which left him with a form of amnesia that meant he was unable to create new memories. This is not exclusively a biography of him, though. It is also a bit of a history of psychosurgery, and also a bit of a history of the author's grandparents. His grandfather was William Scoville, who of course is known for creating the Scoville retractor, and who was the neurosurgeon who performed the surgery on this patient. But he was also the person who performed the second highest number of lobotomies in the United States. Since he was a neurosurgeon, he was doing it in a more precise way than the Freeman types who were doing the ice pick through the orbital that I think we tend to think of when you think of lobotomies these days. But it was still obviously not a great thing. And interestingly, HM was not the only patient he had who ended up having this form of amnesia. It was just that because he had had it for a seizure disorder, whereas the rest of them were having it as psychosurgery for mental illness, those other patients were never used as research subjects because people wouldn't trust the findings on people who were psychotic. Because who knows if their memory loss is a result of psychosis versus brain damage, I think is the argument. So a lot of that was very interesting. In addition to that, the author's grandmother, so William Scoville's wife, had a mental illness and spent a lot of time in, I guess, what we think of as the bad old days of experimental procedures in mental institutions, and the author goes through some of her medical records. That part, which should be the most compelling part of the book, I actually thought was some of the weakest, because he presents those sections in more of a narrative style, and in a way he's trying to build a certain amount of suspense when it comes to that story, and I didn't think that worked particularly well, because once he starts telling that story, it's fairly clear where it's going to go, but because he holds off on the information, even though it's easy to guess where it's going, it ended up irritating me when he returned to that as opposed to the general history and the history of HM, which is quite depressing, not just because he ended up with this amnesia, but also because he spent the rest of his life essentially being owned by researchers, which was a little horrifying, especially because he only passed away in 2008. So even though the surgery was back in the 50s and you think, well, we don't do things like that anymore, he was still being treated as less than a human being by researchers fairly recently. It was definitely very interesting, and it made me want to read more about memory, because there were bits here about memory and how much we've learned from these brain surgeries that went wrong, so that you could pinpoint what part of the brain had been destroyed and what kind of memory loss that caused. And that's all fascinating, and I am interested to go and read more about that specifically. So while this was worth reading, I did think that the author made some choices in terms of structuring it that didn't make it as compelling as it could have been, but still definitely worth checking out. So after that, I picked up Jeff Chang's Who We Be, which is, the subheading is The Colorization of America. I had just read his newer book a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned that in my last wrap-up. This is very different in style. That one was a very straightforward book of essays, whereas this is almost magazine style. It's very dark print on the white backgrounds. It also makes use of a lot of things like cartoons and paintings and images from advertising and television and things like that. And it did feel like reading a number of articles, more in depth. I don't mean that to imply that it's superficial, because not like that, but it did feel magazine style rather than it almost looks like a coffee table book, but there aren't quite enough images for that. In one of the articles in here, or one of the chapters in here, he talks about the United Colors of Benetton ads from the 80s and 90s, and there are some of those reproduced in here, but not nearly enough. I would like to have seen more of them in here. In any case, it's a really interesting look at the history of race relations in the United States from basically the time of the Civil Rights Movement until just a few years ago, maybe 2013, 2014, from a very pop culture angle, which is great, because I mean, obviously pop culture both reflects and informs the common culture, so it was really interesting to read it from that angle as opposed to from a strictly socio-political angle. So this was definitely worth reading. So after that, I read The Caped Crusade, Batman and the Rise of Nerd Culture. This is by Glen Weldon. Despite the title about the rise of nerd culture, this is not really about that. It doesn't actually explore the changing positioning of superhero-style stories in pop culture. What it does do is looks at the history of Batman as a character a little bit, from the origins as kind of a shadow ripoff in the early days, through to the way the comics were presented in the seduction of the innocents, that kind of moral crisis of the 1950s, through to the campy TV series of the 60s, and then the movies and tie-in products that were coming out from 1989 through to the current day. Most of this book takes a fairly broad overview. There isn't a lot of deep... He doesn't talk about, for example, storylines in the comics, and he doesn't really talk about how the adaptations came to be, aside from in a very general way. So if you were looking for something that's digging deep into any of those topics, that's not really what this is. It goes decade by decade and does a very top-level overview, which I think is interesting, but I think it maybe overpromises when it talks about Batman and the rise of nerd culture, because although he goes into products becoming more mainstream as they become cross-media franchises as opposed to just comic book products, but it's not really explored. He spends a lot of time talking about nerds have this idea and normals have this idea, and he keeps up that framing straight through until the current day, without ever digging into the fact that, especially right now, when you look at the numbers of people who buy comics versus the numbers of people who go to see the big superhero movies, or even who just watch the animated series, there's such a difference in numbers that when I picked this up, I expected to see more about that, and that is not what this is about. In any case, even though it wasn't quite digging into the topics that I had assumed it was going to, I did think it was an interesting overview. So I was glad I read it, but I did think it overpromised a little bit with its title. And since I'm talking about Batman, another thing that I read this month was Injustice: Gods Among Us, Year 4, Volumes 1 and 2, and also the complete Year 2. This is the Volume 2 of Year 4. I returned the other ones to the library already. This is a series I've talked about before. It is an alternative universe, the video game universe, for the DC Comics characters, such as Batman and Superman here. The Year 2 was quite entertaining, again, assuming you like superhero books with the multitude of characters and more of an action focus. I'd say it gets less good as it goes on, because I think with any of these alternative universes, a big part of the fun is seeing the differences in style and what they do with the characters versus the sort of mainstream or traditional universe. So once you're past the novelty of that, they don't necessarily stand up very well, and that's definitely what happens here. It was still reasonably entertaining. I still liked a lot of the art, but there's not a lot to say about this. It does its job, but it doesn't do anything more than that. So after that, I picked up another comics collection, and that is Dragon Age Magekiller, which was written by Greg Rucka, and the art is by Carmen Carnero. This was originally published as a miniseries, and unfortunately, because I think this is the kind of book that more people will pick up in trade than we're buying in the monthly comics, each issue led with an introduction to the characters, which means that every 25 pages in this, you're getting the character introductions again and again, which is really repetitive and quite irritating after a while. The story itself and the characters are reasonably entertaining, and I quite like the art. Interestingly, it depicts magic in the imagery in a way that fits very well with the way it's depicted in the combat animations in the game, which is one of those things where when I read franchise books in settings that come from games, I often am irritated when the illustrations are so different from the combat animations, but this bridged that gap in a really solid way, so I liked that. The problem with this, aside from that repetitiveness, is that it really doesn't stand on its own. If you were reading this without having played Dragon Age Inquisition all the way through, this would seem to be ending on a cliffhanger and you would wonder where the next volume is. And this is a standalone miniseries, or a standalone volume here. But if you've played the game, the final panels make it clear that this is led into that, and it seems like a solid ending. So I think that's a bit of a weakness, because it is a Dragon Age franchise book, so you assume that you're going into it as someone who follows the franchise. But even that, if you had played part of the game but not finished it, or if you're going into it having played one of the other Dragon Age games and not Inquisition, I don't think this book holds up on its own. That said, it was entertaining enough, and the art was attractive. So next up, I finished off Richard K. Morgan's A Land Fit for Heroes series. This is The Dark Defiles, which is the third and final volume in that series. When I've talked about this before, what impressed me about the first two volumes the most was that they were tightly written, which is something that is severely lacking in a lot of fantasy writing these days. Unfortunately, this lost a little bit of that, and in that it does get bogged down, and the characters travel this way, then they travel this way, then they travel some more, and that style of writing, which again is something of a tradition in fantasy, but it does leave you with a lot of descriptions that might be interesting in a world-building sense, but are basically bits that could have been left on the cutting room floor. This definitely was not as tightly written as the other two. It's still under 700 pages, but it's still getting into that really long section where you're almost guaranteed to be sitting there saying, where was the editor on this? And actually there were a couple of spelling errors that weren't caught, so where was the editor on this? That said, I was still super entertained by this. I really liked the world, I really enjoyed the three main characters, and I liked the way it wrapped up. It didn't do the thing that a lot of other grimdark books will go, and instead of wrapping things up in any kind of natural way, they'll just kill everyone off, and in a lot of high fantasy, they'll just have everybody live happily ever after. And I don't think either of those things is particularly satisfactory, but this did conclude the story in a way that was satisfying and that didn't seem obsessed with trying to wrap things up, which I appreciated. So I still really liked this series overall. I just thought this last volume needed a bit of an extra run with an editor. So at the same time that I was reading that, I was also reading Ali Smith's Autumn. I think everybody has talked about this. It's on the Man Booker shortlist now. This is very loosely about a woman in her 30s who is friends with a man in his early hundreds. Around the time of the Brexit vote, I almost want to say it's about her memories, but at a certain level it is not, because we occasionally get there'll be something that's clearly a memory of hers, but then we'll be told at the end that she doesn't actually remember the context that we've just heard, she just remembers what happened. There's another point where we hear about a dream that she's had, and we're then told that she doesn't remember the dream. So it's not completely about memory, but reading it, that was what I thought. It felt like we were watching memories. So I liked the flow of that, but it's definitely not something that's going to appeal to anyone who's looking for something with an actual plot or with traditional dialogue, because that is not what this is. It just genuinely feels like the kind of random flow of memories and different bits of time all mixed together. So I quite enjoyed it, but it's definitely not going to be to everyone's taste. Next up, I read The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. This has been super hyped in kind of, I was going to say homemaking circles, but that's not what I mean. Sort of home and design circles. It is very simple in concept. I was going to say the main concept, but no, the only advice that she gives you is you need to clear things out and get over your aversion to getting rid of things. This is essentially 200 pages of her telling you get over it and throw things out, but in a very polite way and with a little bit of a woo-woo element of a thank this item for bringing you happiness and then send it on its way. Which is one of these things, if you were picking this up looking for actual organizational tips, that's not what this is. So I think if you went in with that attitude, you might be disappointed, but for what it was, I found it reasonably enjoyable. And then finally, I read Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere. This is primarily about two families in suburban Cleveland, one of whom is a family with 2 parents and 4 kids who are quite well off, and one of whom is a single parent with a daughter living in a rental duplex that is owned by the other family. This reminded me very strongly of the movie American Beauty, in that it's the same kind of critical-eyed look at late 1990s American suburbia, but with the difference of this is more centered on female characters, whereas that one was more centered on male characters. I was not a huge fan of American Beauty, and I realized that it won the Oscar and people loved it. So when I read this, and fairly early on, I started thinking, this is like American Beauty for women. That automatically meant that this was not going to be my favorite. Nonetheless, I did find this to be extremely readable. I read this in one morning and it was very compelling. I did want to find out what happened, but I didn't think that anything that happened was particularly believable, which is fine because maybe it was meant to be a metaphor, but I didn't think that anything was particularly deep either. Felt like there were a lot of things in this book where we were being presented with something that was so simplified. It almost felt like it was set up to make the reader feel superior to these people, as opposed to consider this actual issue and whether as a matter of degree they might fall closer to them than the other pole. I think this would be a great book club read. I can see how if you read this in your book club and you were going to that discussion, you wouldn't even need to talk about whether you liked the book. You could just talk about those issues. So I think that's great for what it is, but I really felt like this was a book that played with some issues that deserve a lot more nuance than this was giving it. I don't want to act like I disliked this because I did think it was entertaining. And I know some people like this a lot more than I do, just as a lot of people like American Beauty a lot more than I do. And fair enough. I need to go and drink a warm beverage so that I don't completely lose my voice now. That's it for now. Ciao.